Thank you for being here. It is my great pleasure to welcome the delegation of the second year medical students. I'm very sorry that just a few people are interested in the presentation, because, as I mentioned, you, the medical science is a valuable science. You have to speak, and you have to understand. Therefore, it is necessary to have some experience. And this, to listen to a lecture is not a high risk activity. So today we have 2 hours, and during this time we will finish the heart muscle physiology. This last period is the contractile properties. So we will speak about directly what kind of properties are the atrial and ventricular muscle fibers in the heart. Okay, these properties are very similar to the properties of other muscle tissues, but there are very serious differences. As you know, the muscle fibers can contract and can relax. The last occasion we discussed that if the intracellular calcium concentration increases, contractile response will develop, and if this calcium concentration decreases, relaxation will occur. Now, because the heart is a muscle sac, therefore the contraction is called systole. This is the period when the blood is ejected, and the relaxation is the diastole, the relaxation part which makes possible the healing of the atrium or the ventricle sphere. Okay, if we are speaking about the muscle fibers in the heart, we have to take into account that there are contractile elements and there are elastic elements. The contractile elements are able to contract. The elastic elements can be stretched, can be lengthened, and so on. There are many combinations, parallel series elastic elements. This is a very simple scheme where there is a contractile elastic elements in a series connection. Now, if we have to would like to analyze how the heart is working, we have to analyze the isotonic and isometric contraction. The isotonic contraction means that there is no resistance. Therefore, the muscle fibers can shorten, and the length of the elastic elements will not change, because the tension in the fiber doesn't change. So there is simple contraction and shortening. This is the so-called isotonic contraction, where the strength doesn't change. Now, if you try to form the scale to the ventricular muscle, just to make the discussion more simple, we have to speak about the left ventricle, and there is a large artery, the aorta, which starts from the left ventricle. Now, if there is an isotonic contraction, isotonic systole, in this case, the muscle fibers will shorten, the volume of the intraventricular space, the blood there, the volume will be smaller, and without any increase in the pressure, the blood can leave the ventricle because there is no resistance in the periphery, in the aortic pressure. There is no pressure in the aorta. If you would like to make it more seriously, you can make a diagram, a volume pressure diagram of the ventricle. What does it mean? The volume of the ventricle and the intraventricular pressure. Now, in isotonic contraction, the volume decreases because the blood leaves the ventricle, but there is no change in the intraventricular pressure because there is no resistance what the ventricle has to overcome by the intraventricular pressure. Therefore, the blood can leave the ventricle without any increase in the intraventricular pressure. Okay, so this is the line. Now, what about the other possibility? The isometric contraction. Isometric means that the total length doesn't change, so the contraction doesn't shorten the muscle fiber. The contractile elements will be shorter, the elastic elements will be stretched. So finally, the total length will not change. But in the fiber, the tension or the stretch system will increase. How it works in case of a ventricle? For the isometric contraction or isometric systole, we have to suppose that at the output in the aorta there is an infinite resistance, a very high resistance. Therefore, the blood cannot flow out, cannot leave the ventricle, but the intraventricular pressure will be higher and higher. Okay, this is the diagram. We are here, and due to the isometric contraction, the intraventricular pressure is higher and higher, but there is no change in the volume of the ventricle. This is called isometric contraction, or in other words, isovolumetric contraction, isovolumetric system. Okay, but as it used to happen everywhere in the world, nothing is so simple. The system is more complicated. In the aorta, all the time, there is a pressure. If you measure the arterial pressure, 120 over 80 millimeter mercury, therefore it means that within the aorta, minimum 80 millimeter mercury or maximum 120, 140 millimeter mercury pressure exists. Now, if the ventricular contraction tries to eject the blood, first, the intraventricular pressure has to be higher than the pressure in the aorta. Therefore, the contraction starts with an isometric contraction, isovolumetric systole, where nothing else happens, just the intraventricular pressure will be higher and higher until the pressure overcomes the aortic pressure and the blood will flow out. Okay, therefore, if the blood flows out, in this case, it's not necessary to increase further the pressure, just to decrease the volume. And therefore, the second component will be isotonic contraction. Okay, so summarizing what we discussed until now. The work of the heart depends how large is the pressure, what he has to reach and figure, and how large is the volume of the blood which is ejected. So, this is the cardiac work. There are two components. This is the pressure volume component, and the second component is the acceleration work, which gives some velocity to the corpuscular element of the blood. But this acceleration work is very small, 4% or maximum 25% of the total work. Therefore, as a first approximation, we can navigate and we can omit in the whole discussion. So finally, the pressure volume work will remain. Therefore, during a systole, the cardiac work depends on the pressure in the aorta and depends on the volume of the blood which is ejected. If the volume of the blood is 2 times bigger, in this case the cardiac work will be 2 times bigger. If the aortic pressure is not 120 but 240, in this case, to eject the blood, the ventricle has to do 2 times larger work. Okay. Therefore, there is 2 important determinants of the heart rate. How large is the volume and how large is the pressure? Now, what is the volume? The ventricle can eject only how large volume flows into the ventricle. How large is the venous return? How large is the feeding volume of the blood, which can flow in during the diastole, during the relaxation? Generally, just to make the discussion more simple, generally the volume which is ejected 70 milliliter. This is the average value of the flow volume, 70 milliliter. But if the venous return is larger, not 70 milliliter will arrive to the ventricle, but 140 milliliter, 2 times larger amount. In this case, the pressure volume work has to be 2 times larger to be able to eject the whole 140 milliliter against the same pressure. Therefore, because the venous return, the feeding volume is before the heart, morphologically. Therefore, this type of load for the heart is called preload. If the venous return is larger, the preload will be larger. Therefore, the expectation from the ventricle, how larger, will be larger also. What is the other load, which represents the pressure in the aorta? This load is after the heart. Therefore, it is called afterload. If the pressure in the aorta, not 120 millimeter mercury, but only 60 millimeter mercury, in this case, how large the afterload will be. If the aortic pressure will be 2 times larger, 240 millimeter mercury, in this case the afterload will be 2 times larger, and the expectation for the cardiac work will be 3 times larger. Therefore, if we speak about what will determine the cardiac work, we can say first the venous return, the feeding volume, which is called preload, and the second thing how large is the pressure, how large is the peripheral resistance, how large is the pressure in the aorta, and this is the afterload. Okay, now we mentioned that the heart is working in cardiac cycles, so we have to investigate what kind of components the cardiac cycle contains. Do you remember the ECG report? We can discuss the things from one R wave to the next R wave. This is a cardiac cycle. Now, let's go through what we have. First, at this point, there is a diastole. The whole ventricle is relaxed, and the blood can flow in from the large veins and from the atrium. This is the ventricular filling, which happens during the diastole. As I just mentioned, it's very important to protect the heart from a second systole, because the second systole disturbs this filling. You can see here that during this filling period, the intraventricular volume increases. After, an R wave starts, and due to the depolarization of ventricular muscle fibers, contraction will occur. But the blood cannot be ejected until the intraventricular pressure doesn't reach the intra-aortic pressure. Therefore, the first period is the isovolumetric systole, which means that there's no change in the volume, but the pressure, the intraventricular pressure, will increase until it will be larger than the aortic pressure. As soon as this pressure will be higher than the pressure in the aorta, in this case, the aortic valve will open, and the blood will be ejected towards the periphery into the aorta. Okay, this increase in the pressure is, for example, 100 millimeter mercury, the increase, and the ejected volume is roughly 70 milliliter. Now, how long will the ejection start? Until the ventricular muscle fibers starts to repolarize. Relax, and the pressure will drop down. And in this case, it's where in the aortic valve will close, and the ventricular relaxation starts. No, but this relaxation at the beginning, the pressure aortic pressure is 120 millimeter mercury. In the large veins and in the atrium, the pressure is nearly zero. Therefore, to make the feeling possible, the ventricular muscle fiber has to relax, and until the pressure will be lower than the pressure in the atrium. At this point, the AV valve will open, and the feeling starts. The feeling, which means that 70 milliliter blood will flow into the ventricle. So this is the simple story. Now, this figure, which is very simple, they basically this one, after very simple part introduction. Now, this is called pressure volume loop of the ventricle. The pressure volume loop. Okay, and it is repeated 70 times in a minute and many, many million times in a lifetime. Okay. Now, how can we continue the contact properties? We have to measure and have to speak about the pumping function. How the blood will be injected to the periphery. The basic unit is the cardiac output. The cardiac output means how large volume of blood is injected during a minute. Therefore, the 70 milliliter will be multiplied by 70 times in a minute, and this will be 4.9 liters, or in average 5 liters. So the normal physiological cardiac output is 5 liters over a minute. It means that 5 liters of blood is flowing towards the aorta during a minute. Don't forget that the total volume of blood is also 5 liters roughly. And it doesn't mean that the whole blood will flow through the left ventricle, but the same amount, because there are areas in the human body where the circulation speed is very, very low. The blood is staying there. And there are, in the aorta and other, the velocity of the circulation is very high, therefore they can go through the left ventricle several times. Now, how can we measure the cardiac output? We can take the stroke volume. This is the volume of the blood which is injected during one systole, and the heart rate. This is the 70 milliliter multiplied by the 70 over a minute. It is the cardiac output. How can we measure this cardiac output? There are different methods, older methods or newer methods, but you can find them in the lecture, so you don't spend the time. The FIC methods measure the oxygen consumption, and for the arteriovenous difference can found that, for example, this consumed oxygen was transported how many liters of blood. Okay, the indicator dilation method is a little bit complicated. We have to inject some indicator into the bloodstream, and we have to measure the appearance after the application in a certain way you can calculate. From our point of view, it is not important. So the next very sophisticated question, how the cardiac output is regulated in the human body. What will determine how large is the cardiac output? The answer is very simple. We can modify the heart rate, and the stroke volume can be modified too. Therefore, the product will be modified also. Now, what about the heart rate? We mentioned that the heart rate can be changed only by the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic fibers will increase the heart rate, the parasympathetic fibers will decrease the heart rate. Simple. If the heart rate drops down to the half of it, but the stroke volume doesn't change, in this case the cardiac output will be half of the original value. But if the sympathetic fibers are stimulated and the heart rate instead of 70 will be 140 times in a minute, 2 times higher, if the stroke volume doesn't change, the cardiac output will be 2 times larger. Okay? So a simple linear relationship between these things. What about the stroke volume? The stroke volume can be modified also, but is a little bit longer story. We can start with the second one. The stroke volume can be larger if the sympathetic stimulation results in positive inotropic effect. It will be a larger contractile force, a stronger contraction, and the stroke volume can be larger, or similarly can be smaller also. But the change of the resting length, it is the other possibility to modify the stroke volume. In other words, to modify the contractile force of the muscle fibers, the contractile force, without any autonomic nerves effect. Just on denervated part, when all the sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers are cut, in this case, we can change the stroke volume by changing the resting length. What does it mean, changing the resting length? If we take a single muscle fiber and we increase the length, it means that we have to stretch the muscle fibers. We can express it that the sarcomere length will be larger and larger if you can measure the sarcomere length. But you can say that the resting length is 100%, and you increase the resting length to 130%. And it is the same, increasing the length. Now, the resting length modifies the contractile force. So the stretching of the fibers will produce larger and larger contractile response. It is the intrinsic properties of the skeletal muscle fibers, the myofilaments, things, the number of cross bridges and calcium sensitivity and so on. It is not important. The significant thing is that if you increase the resting length, the positive tension of muscle fiber will increase, and in this situation, you apply electric stimulation and evoke action potentials. In this case, the contractile response will be larger and larger. So, if you stretch the muscle fiber, or if you increase the resting length, or you increase the sarcomere length, the same thing, the contractile force will be larger, just to a limit. Okay. This is this figure, this part of the figure shows the result of an experiment, very interesting. And the first record is a contractile response, where the sarcomere length is very small, and there is a certain contractile response. In the case of the two, the second case, the sarcomere length is longer, we stretch the muscle fiber a little bit more, and the contractile response is much, much larger. Now, continuing the experiments, we will stretch the fiber more. This is the position 3. The resting length is large. You can see here that this passive tension is larger and larger. And this case of 3 trace will be a very large, the maximum contractile response, because this resting length is the longest one. Now, but if we overstretch the fiber, the sarcomere length is too long. This is the phase number 4. This is the longest sarcomere length. You can see that the tension, increasing the tension, is smaller than in the previous case. What does it mean? It means that by increasing the length, we can increase the contractile force, but just up to a really void. If you stretch further, the contractile response will be smaller. Now, another complicated question. How the ventricular muscle fiber can increase its resting length? What will determine that how large is the resting length? The answer is very simple. If the feeling volume is larger and larger, the ventricle will be larger and larger, and the muscle fibers will be more and more stretched. Therefore, if we evoke contractile responses at different diastolic volume, at different feeling volumes, the contractile responses will be larger and larger. The results of this experiment can be shown here. This is the diastolic volume. More and more blood flows into the ventricle, and the end of the diastole, it is a so-called end diastolic volume. The volume of the ventricle will be larger and larger, and the length of the muscle fibers will be longer and longer. And you can see, if you stimulate the fiber, the systolic pressure will be larger and larger. This is the first, second, third position. First, second, third position. This is the diastolic pressure. In other words, it is the positive tension due to the feeling of the ventricle. And this is the active tension, the systolic tension, at the end of the systolic response. Therefore, the difference between them is the increase in the contractile tension. What is the situation at the position 4? We overstretched the muscle. You can see that the change in the tension is much smaller than the change here at the same position. You can see. Therefore, overstretched. And there is a certain point here where we overstretch the muscle and cannot contract at all. Therefore, the active increase in the tension is zero. Now, fortunately, the heart muscle is a very well organized system. Therefore, the connective tissues are so strong that we cannot overstretch up to this point. It will stop somewhere here. But because the increase in the tension, the contractile force means larger work, therefore the heart has to use the smallest increase in the tension which is necessary. It is necessary to overcome the pressure in the aorta, or which is necessary to eject the volume and so on. Not more energy, because it's a very bad energy-saving system. Therefore, there are many possibilities to increase the contractile force by changing the resting length. Okay, this is this sentence here. How the stroke volume is controlled by changing the resting length, because the expression is not completely right, because what is controlled here? The work of the heart, the pressure volume work. If you increase the resting length, this increase in the resting length can be used to eject bigger volume of blood, or can be used to eject the same volume of blood but against a higher peripheral resistance. Okay. Now, we turn back to how the cardiac function is controlled. Basically, there are two possibilities. The first one is the heterometric regulation, which means that the length of the fibers changes, increasing the resting length, the contractile response, and the cardiac work will be larger. This is the heterometric because the length changes. The other possibility, when the regulation is without any change in the length. Without any change, therefore, it is homometric, where the length doesn't change, but the contractile force can be larger. What is it? The sympathetic stimulation, the positive inotropic effect. There is no change in the resting length, but the contractile force will be larger. Here at the heterometric regulation, the contractile response can be larger without any adrenergic stimulation, without any sympathetic excitation, only just increasing the length. Now, heterometric regulation. There was an American physiologist, Starling, who described first this phenomenon. He told that the ventricular performance, the cardiac work can be regulated by the diastolic volume, when it is necessary to increase the ventricular performance. What can be? If the peripheral resistance in the aorta is higher, or if the venous return, the preload, the feeling volume is larger. Why? Because if the feeling is larger, a larger amount has to eject to the periphery. If the pressure is high, but the volume doesn't increase, in this case, larger work is necessary to eject the same volume against a higher peripheral resistance. So, basically, Starling told that at denervated heart, where the adrenergic fibers doesn't do anything, we can increase the cardiac work in case of increased peripheral resistance or in case of increased venous return by increasing the diastolic volume, stretching the fibers and increase the contractile response. The question is easy to understand the second case. If more blood flows into the ventricle, not 70 milliliters, but 100, 120, very simple, because the end diastolic volume will be larger, the fibers will be stretched, and the increased volume will be ejected. But what is the mechanism? If the peripheral resistance is higher, how the diastolic volume will be larger to stretch the fibers? If the 70 milliliters are ejected at the systole, but very quickly they increase the peripheral resistance, the heart, using the same work, with the same performance, cannot eject the 70 milliliter because the work is not enough. The pressure volume product. Just 50, 40 milliliter will be ejected. And 20, 30 milliliters will remain in the ventricle. But during the next diaspora, 70 milliliters arise also. And now the end diastolic volume will be 100 milliliter. And it will stretch the fiber and the contractile response will be larger. Now, of course, the change not so dramatic. maybe 10 milliliters remains in the ventricle, at the next occasion 20, 30, 40, and finally the end-diastolic volume will be gradually larger and larger, and finally the ejected volume will be larger and larger. Therefore, after 5 or 10 systolic diastolic cycle, the ejected volume will be the same, then the venous return from the periphery. Okay. The starting, because this is called starting slow. The starting slow is the same as the heterometric regulation. By regulating the stroke volume, by increasing the resting lengths. These are the same phenomena. Okay, when Starling wanted to prove that the starting slow is true, he developed a heart-lung preparation, which contains an absolutely generated heart. All the sympathetic, parasympathetic fibers were cut, but the ventilation through the lung was maintained by artificial ventilation, just supply the oxygen for the working tissues. And but the general circulatory part, the aorta from the left ventricle, is connected to the outer circulation, a tubing system, where the peripheral resistance can be controlled by increasing the pressure here. And the blood flows through this venous reservoir to the right atrium. From the right atrium, the blood flow to the lung, took out of oxygen, and arrive to the left atrium. Now, what was finally the story? Finally, it happened that the venous return could be regulated by this venous reservoir. If they elevated the dish, the pressure will be larger, and could increase the venous return 2 times larger and so on, and could measure that how large is the venous return by measuring the pressure in the atrium. It's the atrial pressure, which is the pressure for the feeling. Okay, what they figured out? They realized, and the ventricle was placed in a volume meter to a dish where the increase in the volume could be recorded. This very simple and primitive system told simple that if the venous return is larger, after several contraction relaxation cycling, the cardiac output will be larger, and they realized that if the peripheral resistance is higher, increase the peripheral resistance after certain cardiac cycles, the end-diastolic volume increase, and finally the same volume was ejected. Okay, after this one, the question arises, what is the significance in physiological circumstances that there is a very starting slow? That without any adrenergic stimulation, the contractile force can be higher. Now, I would like to mention 3 examples. The first one, today, is quite general to transplant new heart to a patient. nervous system cannot be restored. Therefore, the transplanted heart basically is a denervated heart. And it's very interesting that these people having transplanted heart can work, can do physical exercise, can increase the cardiac output. How? The heart rate cannot change, but the stroke volume can increase. Why? Because if you would like to do some exercise or physical work, the sympathetic system will be stimulated, and for example, the large veins has vasoconstriction. Therefore, the venous return force increased, and this increased venous return force will stretch the ventricular muscle fibers and really increase the stroke volume and the cardiac output. It's a definitive thing. What is the last occasion? In physiological, innervated situation, this is important. Easy to understand that the output of the right ventricle and the left ventricle has to be the same, because these circulatory systems are connected in series. Therefore, if the right ventricle increases the cardiac output from 5 liters over a minute to 6 liters or 7 liters, the left ventricle has to increase too. Because what will happen with the 1 or 2 liter extra blood in the lung? How the left ventricle will increase the stroke volume? It will increase because the end diastolic volume will increase due to the larger filling, and the output of the left ventricle will be automatically selected to the same level where the right ventricle is working. Or reverse, if the left ventricle increase the output, the right ventricle will increase too, without any reflex regulation, without any nervous effect, just due to the intrinsic properties of the muscle fibers. Finally, we can go to the other way of the regulation, is the homeometry, which is based on the positive ionizing effect of the adrenaline stimulation. And it means that the ventricular performance can be regulated without any change in the resting length, just due to the positive inotropic effect. What does it mean? Where is the reserve which makes it possible? This is the end systolic volume, which means that because the ejection is more complete, because the contractile force is larger, therefore the stroke volume will be larger. Of course, the venous return has to follow it. Okay, finally, there is a simple scheme which summarizes this diastolic reserve and this systolic reserve. How it works. This axis represents the volume of the ventricle. The maximum volume, 160 milliliter. 160 milliliter blood can fit to the left ventricle. How the normal working looks like? It is the normal stroke volume. What does it mean? At the end of the systole, end systolic volume will be then 50 milliliter of blood in the ventricle, and there is a contraction. The stroke volume is ejected, and I'm sorry, I missed it. And systolic volume, the feeling follows. The feeling will bring 70 milliliter blood. It is a feeding volume, and at the end of diastole, the volume of the ventricle will be 120 milliliters. The contraction starts here, and the stroke volume will be ejected, and we will reach the end systolic volume. This is the physiological resting state. At the end of the systole, a certain amount of blood remains in the ventricle, and at the end of the diastole, it would be some space for more blood, but it is not utilized. Okay, what happens if we increase the resting length and evoke this hypermetric regulation? In this case, the feeling is larger and larger, and the end diastolic volume will be, instead of 100, 140, 160 milliliters, the fibers will be stretched, and the contractile force will be larger, and the stroke volume will be larger with 40 milliliters. Instead of 70, 110, there's a 10 milliliters. What happened? The contractile force was increased for the expense of the possibility that the end diastolic volume could be larger. So this is basically a reserve volume which can be utilized if the feeling is larger. Therefore, this is called diastolic reserve. This is the Starling's law, the hypermetric regulation. Okay, return back to the normal resting contraction. The end of the systole, 50 milliliters remain in the ventricle, but if there is a sympathetic adrenergic stimulation, in this case the contractile force will be larger, and the end systolic volume will be a smaller number. The stroke volume will be 20, 30, 40 milliliters larger. Therefore, we can say that the sympathetic system can increase the stroke volume because there is some extra blood in the ventricle which is not ejected in a normal cycle, just if the contractile force is larger. Therefore, this reserve is called systolic reserve because it can be utilized by the increased systole. This diastolic reserve can be utilized if the feeling is larger and more blood flows to the ventricle. Okay, so the cardiac output is controlled. No, it's not. I just would like to show you that because the heart and the pulmonary circulation is pressure is smaller, therefore the ventricular output is here at the right half and is the left half, not interesting. This is the cardiac output, 5 liters. If we increase the aortic pressure, the same volume will be maintained because the cardiac will be larger and larger, and finally it goes on. Okay, it is not. Now, we have to continue with the pumping function. Why can the blood flow all the time into the same direction? From the atrium to the ventricle, from the ventricle to the large arteries, and so on. What is the reason, the explanation of the unidirectional flow of blood? Very simple, because there are layers. Layers are passive structures, but they rectify the blood flow in opposite direction, cannot allow the blood to flow because they close. In the bear, we don't find any muscle, only the pressure difference regulated. Okay, we can find 4 veins in the heart. 2 veins are in the left side, one in the atrium and between the atrium and the ventricle, and the other one between the ventricle and the aorta. This is the aortic vein, and this is the mitral vein. Therefore, at the left side, there are 2 veins. Between the atrium and the ventricle is the mitral vein, and if the ventricle starts to contract, sphere closes and don't allow to flow back the blood. And this is the aortic. Aortic vein opens when the increased pressure is larger than the pressure in the aorta. In this case, the aortic vein opens. When the pressure drops down, the aortic vein closes. The closure of the aortic vein produces the second heart sound. So this is the left side of the pressure. It's all functioning of the aortic vein. Okay. What about the atrial ventricular order? The mitral vein closes if the pressure increases and is closed where do not flow back of the blood. And this vein opens again when the pressure in the aorta drops down. And okay, the same 2 veins can be found at the right side. And the pulmonary artery is the pulmonary vein, and between the atrium and the ventricle, the tricuspid vein. Now, when these veins close, it is both produce the first heart sound, and this semilunar veins closes, they produce the second heart sounds. If you would like to simulate this one, move, 2, move, 2. Therefore, the medical doctor can realize that which is the first heart sound and which is the second heart sound. Very important is the difference, because after the second heart sound, the relaxation follows and the feeling, and after the first sound, the ventricular contraction starts. So therefore, between the first and the second is the systole. Between the second heart sound to the first heart sound is the diastole. It's very important at the rare failure to know that where we are. Okay, now if you know the working of the bears, we can continue and maybe discuss this funny picture. Don't worry, it's not so complicated. This is a complex figure which indicates the ECG record, the aortic pressure, the left ventricular pressure, the left atrial pressure, the volume of the ventricle. We'll show the first heart sound, and this is how the valves are closed or open. Now let's go. What happens? The cardiac cycle contains 2 large periods. It's very important. The first large period is the ventricular systole. The ventricular systole, which starts with the R wave, where the ventricular muscle fibers are stimulated and contracted, and will last until the systole is finished and the diastole starts. And the second large period of the cardiac cycle is the ventricular diastole. Okay? Why is it necessary to say that ventricular systole and ventricular diastole? Because the atrium has a systole too. And you see here that the atrial systole is part of the ventricular diastole. Okay. What kind of failure has the ventricular? First, it is necessary to pressure the ventricular pressure atom. First, azimuthal pulsation, and the feeling starts. That is this form and this form. Now, again, we will indicate what happens if the heart rate changes. If we increase the heart rate, different historical, what happens with the different interval times? How the diastolic feeling, the duration of diastolic feeling will change, and how the duration of the ejection will change. It's quite close. If the heart rate is higher and higher, the total time of the cardiac cycle is decreasing. If the heart rate is 60 over a minute, and its interval time is 1 second, the time of the cardiac cycle. But if the heart rate is 120, the time of the duration of the cardiac cycle is only half a second. So there is a decrease. Now, this figure indicates that how the diastolic feeling change at higher and higher frequency. And you can see the columns. If the heart rate is higher, the decrease in the duration of the diastole is larger than the decrease in the ejection time. If you measure these durations at 60 over minute frequency, you can see here the diastolic feeling time is 2 times longer than the ejection time. But if we increase the heart rate to 120, in this case, the ejection time will be longer and the diastole time of the feeling is shorter. Therefore, at high frequency, the diastolic feeling will not complete, will not be enough. I would like just to tell you something. Further, the autonomic nerves will take a heart and you electrically stimulate the heart and evoke systole and is followed by diastole. If you stimulate the heart with a 60 over minute frequency, in this case, the 70 milliliter of blood can be filled up, and the same volume can be ejected. But if you stimulate the heart with a faster frequency, the diastole, the time of the diastole will be half of it. Therefore, it can occur that during the diastole, not 70 milliliters, but only 35 milliliters can flow into the ventricle, just half of it, because the frequency is 2 times larger. Therefore, the output will be smaller. Therefore, if you stimulate a denervated heart and increase the frequency, the stroke volume will be smaller. But what about the cardiac output, the volume during a beat? Because the frequency is 2 times higher, in the instead of 60, 120, and the stroke volume instead of 70, only 35. Therefore, the product of the larger frequency and the smaller stroke volume can be the same as in the original situation at low frequency. Therefore, the higher frequency ought to increase the cardiac output. But because due to the decreased feeding, the stroke volume will be smaller, therefore the increased heart rate will not result in the cardiac. What is the difference if the increasing of the heart rate is produced by stimulating the sympathetic fibers? The frequency will be 120. But interestingly, the cardiac output will not remain the same, but will be 2 times higher than at 60 over a minute. The difference is that increasing the heart rate by adrenergic stimulation will increase the contractile force also. Therefore, if the heart rate is increased by the adrenergic stimulation, in this case, the heart rate and the cardiac output will be linearly related. But in linear-related muscle, when the contractile force cannot change, in this case, the cardiac output will be larger. Now, we have to discuss here something. The trained athletes, the sportmen, you know that very nice thing, after the physical exercise, the heart rate doesn't increase too much, but remain low. What is the reason? At low heart rate, the diastolic feeling is better. Therefore, the trained athletes increase the cardiac output much more by increasing the stroke volume instead of increasing the heart rate. Because the increasing heart rate to decrease the diastole is not so nice. Okay. Now, because this is a medical physiology, has to discuss some pathology consequences of this pumping activity of the heart. And it is what happens if the valves has some failure, that the valves are not complete. There are 2 possibilities. the narrow veins, which is called stenosis. The horizontal just remain at the aorta vein. The aortic stenosis, the vein has a smaller diameter, therefore the pathway through which the blood is ejected towards the aorta is smaller, and the smaller vein increases the peripheral resistance. Therefore, the heart has to use a larger valve to eject the same volume of the blood. But because this vein is stenotic, the ejection is much less. There is a turbulent flow. And the turbulent flow produces murmurs. The previous one was the first and second part sound. The sound is not murmur, it is the closure of the vein. This is murmur, which is due to the turbulent flow. And we can mention the systolic murmur, which can be listened during the ventricular systole, and we can listen to the diastolic murmur during the ventricular diastole, and the differentiation with which one is the systolic murmur, which one is the diastolic murmur, depends on the location of the murmur. Between the first and second sound, which is the time of the ventricular systole, this murmur is the systolic murmur. And this systolic murmur at the aortic vein results in systolic murmurs during the systole, because much more difficult to eject the blood. What is the consequence of this narrow stenosis? Using do you remember the heart work is the pressure volume work? Now, if the ejection of the blood is more difficult, and not 70 milliliters, but only 35 milliliters can be ejected during the systole, because the ejection is more difficult because the vein is stenotic. In this case, the half of the volume will go to the aorta. And in this case, if the heart would like to maintain the normal cardiac output, has to double the stroke volume by sympathetic stimulation or by increasing the resting rate, and ejection in ejecting 70 milliliters instead of 35. Now, the cell ejection of 70 milliliters requires 2 times higher work than the ejection of 35. Therefore, if the aortic stenosis is strong enough, in this case, to maintain the cardiac output, the heart has to do 2 times larger work. Okay, what about the other heart failure? The other heart failure is the insufficiency. When the closure of the vein is not complete, not perfect. Therefore, after the ventricular systole, the 70 milliliter blood is ejected towards the aorta, but if the aortic vein is insufficient, a certain proportion of the blood will flow back to the ventricle. Suppose that 35 milliliter flows back. Only just half of the ejected blood remains in the periphery. The other half flows back. And in this case, to maintain original cardiac output, the ventricle has to eject 140 milliliter because half of it will flow back, and this ejection performance is necessary to reach the stroke volume of 70 milliliter. Therefore, the cardiac work will be 2 times larger also. Therefore, the heart failures produce a very large hemodynamics and increase very much the work of the heart for the proper maintaining the circulatory system. Okay. Now we mentioned that if the aortic layer is stenotic, we will hear the murmur during the systole. If the heart, if the blood flows back through the aortic layer because the layer is insufficient, in this case, we will listen the murmur during the diastole. And in this case, the feeling will not be only from the atrium, but from the aorta, the backbone. Okay. What can we do with the heart failures? The very important thing to observe, to realize, to describe as soon as possible. And it is necessary to follow the heart. What are the consequences of the heart failure? And not to wait until the heart muscle completely exhausts, but when the exhaustion starts, we have to do the valve operation to change to improve to change the layers to the proper one. There are synthetic layers, or it is possible to produce layers from the pigs and so on. Okay, now if you measure the different pressures schemes in the aorta, they can take some consequences to the heart failure. What does it mean? The aortic layer is insufficient. During diastole, the blood flows back to the ventricle. What will be the consequence? If after the systole, the pressure of the aorta is high, but as soon as the systole is over, the pressure goes down. Maybe it can go down to 0. Therefore, the next systole has to increase the aortic pressure from 0 to up to 180 or something like that, because half of the blood will flow back. And there are other differences in case of stenotic aortic layer. In this case, the amplitude of the slave is smaller, but it is not necessary to discuss further. This is not a problem, it is hypertension. This is the hypertension, the right one. The conductor, the diastolic pressure is 80, the systolic pressure is 120. But in case of hypertension, it's much higher when aortic pressure is maintained. This is the problem. Too large work is necessary to increase because the peripheral stress is very high in case of hypertension. Therefore, the heart has to do a larger work. Okay, I think this is enough because we need to explain the details. If heart failure is maintained for a long period of exhaust the working muscle. This is called heart failure. When the heart is not able to produce the same performance to carry out the same cardiac work. Exhaust. Okay. It's a very old question. How can we prevent the heart failure? How can we maintain the contractile force of the working muscle fibers? And there were many investigations, but not too many results. But nowadays, we can speak about a significant progress in the applied methods. Therefore, our knowledge and information about the heart failure is much better. What is the first improvement in the technique? In enzymatic isolation, it is possible to isolate single cardiac myocytes. A certain type of enzymatic digestion can separate the different single fibers to remove them from the syncytium. But it is possible to carry out this type of isolation in such a way that the membrane is restored, the membrane resistance will be high again, the myoplasmic space is maintained in the contractility, and we can stimulate these single fibers, or we can control the membrane potential by attachment technique. We can apply different fluorescence indicator dyes into the muscle and to measure the resting calcium level, and after how the calcium concentration increases during the systole and how decreases during the diastole. And it is possible to isolate these myocytes from patients which had heart surgery operation, and it was possible to remove cellular fibers during the operation and study in this enzymatic isolation. Now let's go. What were the results? The results was that it is as a control calcium transients. It is the resting calcium level. This is the rising phase. It is healthy heart fibers. And this is the calcium removal from the myoplasmic space, the relaxation period. We will know that this removal due to the calcium ATPase back to the SR and the sodium calcium exchanger, the surface membrane. What happens? What they scientists could measure if they use ill single fibers from patients having heart failure, and they found that the resting calcium level is much higher, 2 times larger than the healthy fibers. The rising phase is very small, and during the diastole, the decrease of calcium concentration, the removal of calcium is much, much smaller. It's quite easy to see that the released calcium is very small. The increase of calcium level is much smaller than in the control fibers. Okay, what kind of conclusion is drawn from this one? The main conclusion is that the SR calcium ATPase is much, much smaller. The ATPase activity is lower and can cannot reaccumulate the calcium back to the SR, cannot reaccumulate. What is the consequence? The resting calcium level is higher. It's very dangerous because the intracellular calcium level is high. Therefore, different arrhythmias can appear because the gap junctions, the resistance of the gap junction can increase if the intracellular calcium is high. Therefore, the syncytium cannot work properly as in healthy conditions. So, the increased resting calcium is very dangerous because different arrhythmias can complicate the situation. What is the other? Because the calcium ATPase activity is low, it means that the reaccumulation of the calcium back to the SR is smaller. Therefore, the calcium content of the SR is lower. Therefore, the calcium content which is available for the next release is smaller. So, because the ATPase activity is not strong enough, it allows the increase in the resting calcium level. It will result in a smaller SR calcium content. And the third consequence of the low calcium ATPase, that the calcium reuptake is low and the relaxation is much prolonged, much slower. Okay. This column diagram indicates you this is the physiological situation, a healthy situation. This is the amount of calcium which originates from the extracellular space, and this is the amount of calcium released from the SR. If the calcium ATPase activity decreases due to the heart failure, basically the calcium which enters during the throttle phase doesn't decrease because it's coming easily. But there is no enough calcium in the SR available for the release. Therefore, the amount of release calcium is much smaller. This is the final result, and the total increase of calcium is much smaller in heart failure than in physiological circumstances. What kind of attempts were done to improve this situation? The first imagination was that if we increase the sodium-calcium exchanger, we can remove the calcium faster from the myoplasmic space and can improve the situation. Not too much happened. And the second was, the phospholamban inhibits the calcium ATPase. If we try to knock out the gene for the phospholamban, and the people produce the phospholamban knockout animals, and in this case, the inhibiting effect decreased, and therefore they could improve a little the calcium ATPase activity. But in the human cases, these possibilities are basically not valid. The best thing to prevent the heart failure by doing the heart surgery in time, exactly the proper time, then it's quite clear that the heart cannot compensate the situation, but before it acts out, before it acts out. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, these were the basic things related to the heart physiology. highly recommend you just as soon as possible, because very difficult to understand the circulation without these things. Thank you very much for your attention.